Actually, I'm very, very happy to. Where's the water? Shit. Oh, there it is. Okay. Okay. The bravery and courage of my Israeli debate friends who go out every day, every week to protest against these heinous reforms is something that I admire incredibly. And I'm going to explain in this speech why that's likely to translate into actual change and the removal of Netanyahu. Let's be clear about our burden in this debate. All we have to show is that Netanyahu leaves office for some reason, either in an election or he's forced out. That's what we're going to prove. We don't necessarily need to prove he remains out of power forever, just that it leads to his direct exit from office instantly. So, there are going to be a few things in this speech. Firstly, explaining just how important this reform is and why it's hugely opposed. Secondly, explaining why the opposition has a huge amount of leverage in Israel at the moment to lead to change. And thirdly, explaining how this translates into Netanyahu's removal. So, I want to start by explaining how important this judicial reform is, because the info slide is quite dry, it's unclear why this is significant. The reason is very simple. Israel doesn't have a constitution, that's a legacy of us as in the British, because we gave them that. Israel doesn't have a constitution, which means there are no backstops or long-term reforms that you could have in place that ensure a basic guarantee of rights, which means that the Supreme Court, which was previously apolitical and elected uniformly, was the backstop of that, right? And it tended to be quite liberal, because lawyers within it, had this kind of sense of reform. They wanted to at the very least uphold democracy. They were inculcated into those particular values, which means that obviously so essentially what this law is trying to do is to make those Supreme Court justices politically elected. It's trying to remove them from having scrutiny or oversight over particular laws that may be discriminatory. It's trying to get rid of all of those things. And I think this is seen as something that is massively harmful. I'm going to explain why in terms of translating into terrible opposition. But I want to be clear, because opposition might say, but if these laws are unpopular, why can't Netanyahu compromise on them? There are two reasons. The first is that Netanyahu himself is being held accountable for previous corruption cases by the Supreme Court, which means he wants to detooth the Supreme Court as much as possible by removing power from them. The second is that his coalition partners, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, are super obsessed with passing this law because they are far-right Israeli people who massively hate the Supreme Court because they view them as unelected, they view them as just, this liberal imposition, whatever. And so, insofar as they are the tipping point of government because Netanyahu has a small majority of only 4 seats, and they won't compromise on this, Netanyahu himself is unable to compromise on this either. So, okay, given that then, I want to explain first of all why there is widespread opposition to the removal of the Supreme Court. And there are 3 things I want to explain here. The first is that, Israeli people, in their idea of themselves and their construction of their national identity, and especially secular people living in cities like Tel Aviv, etc., constructed themselves as like the only democracy in the Middle East, the only place in that part of the world that is able to maintain liberal reforms, that is able to be relatively progressive, that is able to, have a relatively equal treatment of people. And that narrative of yourself goes away at the point at which a government is able to change laws such that it can then pass things that, massively can remove the rights of people just on a simple majority. So that narrative is really played up. But the second thing is that people within Israel, especially the opposition, view this as kind of a tipping point in Israel's progress, right? Because insofar as the demographics within Israel are trending towards increasing religious people in the next 30 to 40 years, people view this as a tipping point to massively empower that group. And so it's assumed essentially existential stakes for people on the ground in Israel to ensure that they will never be able to, compromise or go against these particular laws passing. So I think what that means is that there is widespread entrenched opposition. And I've given some reasons, but just look at the world, There have been protests that have been going on for the past year that have had hundreds of thousands of people coming out. There was a widespread general strike, etc., etc. Clearly this is something that a lot of people oppose. Now, I want to be very clear about why the opposition specifically has a huge amount of leverage within Israel. There are a few things I want to note here. The first is that the army, ironically, in Israel is relatively left-wing or relatively more progressive than the government. The reason is simple. It's because Orthodox or super religious people don't have to conscript within the army within Israel because, they have an exemption essentially, which means that the army army is relatively secular. And that's really important because they are also opposed to this for the reasons that I've explained earlier. They are the kind of people from Tel Aviv or whoever going to fight on the front lines. And what that means is they have a huge amount of leverage because obviously Israel is a state that is constantly under existential threat. So when the army says something or when the army is willing to go on strike, that has a huge effect on the people within Israel and has huge amounts of say and power. And we've seen this happening already. So we've seen things like the Air Force saying that they're not going to fly properly. We've seen generals come out and oppose this as well. The second thing I would note is that the opposition for this law is concentrated also within the tech sector, right, which is the primary driver of the Israeli economy, insofar as, that is how they've been able to specialize and grow and develop, because they have a unique advantage in terms of relatively good education, but still relatively cheap labor. And what that means is that these people, when they threaten to go on strike, massively threaten the economy of Israel, and this has already happened to some extent, or they threaten to leave, like some tech companies have done. This is a huge amount of leverage insofar as it enables the economy of Israel as well in general. But the third thing I would note is that there has already been general strikes. Israel has already ground to a halt. Netanyahu was already forced to quote-unquote compromise by, delaying the law to some extent. So these tactics have already worked to some extent in the past, and I think they're going to continue. The last thing I would note is that there is large-scale international pressure as well for Netanyahu to compromise from the US and so on. So we will talk about that more. Now, I want to be very clear about why this will translate into change. I think the protests can inflict so much harm, essentially, that Netanyahu will be forced out of office, basically, because that is what people are demanding. This has become an existential battle about Netanyahu himself and the direction in which he is taking Israel. They won't even accept removing the judicial law at this point. They'll only accept the removal of Netanyahu, the removal of these extreme far-right influences within government. But the second thing I would note is that some people within Likud itself could defect and bring them to government, and there was precedent for this with the defense minister who threatened to resign as well. That can continue. Before I go on to talk about an actual election, closing. Yeah, okay, I'm going to get to this. Okay, so what happens in an actual election now? Because obviously an election has to happen within a few years because that's constitutionally mandated within Israel, and Netanyahu can't get rid of this because his justification for passing this law is that he reflects the true will of the people. Now, I think there are two broad tactics opposition can say as to how Netanyahu might be able to win this election. The first thing that he might do is, call in some operation or something and attack Palestine or something like this, try and distract people and try and maintain his power that way. We think this is unlikely to work insofar as Netanyahu has lost the support of the military with this legislation. The second thing they might say is that the opposition is extremely polarized in Israel, and there are loads of different parties, and so they're unlikely to unify. I think, though, that on this specific issue, the opposition is likely to unify, for the reason that, obviously, as I said in my setup, this is assumed existential stakes, and so people are willing to put aside their differences and ensure that Netanyahu is removed. We saw this happen with Yair Lapid previously when Netanyahu was last voted out of office. They need to show why this won't likely happen again. I think it probably will. So, given that then, there is widespread opposition to this law, particularly in the groups in Israel who are the most powerful within that particular country. We think they have the leverage to grind this government to the halt. We think they will accept nothing less than the removal of Netanyahu because Netanyahu is personally tainted by this, and even if not, Netanyahu can never compromise. The only resolution is him being forced out. Very proud to propose. Yeah?
On side opening opposition, we're going to provide you with structural reasons as to why this is unlikely to happen. And also, note panel, we have to stand that this is not going to be the tipping point. Side government has to stand that this is going to be the key delta in Netanyahu leaving out of office. They kind of run away from this burden. They say, oh, it's going to be an amalgamation of things, economic unrest, stuff like that. No, they have to stand that this reform is going to cause such distress and political capital to remove from office. two things from opening opposition. First, it's hard to capitalize on existing political capital coming from opposition, coming from protests, to remove him off office via elections. And secondly, that after the reform, due to his power, he's going to have even more power due to other factors coming into play. But firstly, notice a bit of context. Netanyahu has a majority that allows him to actually push for this reform. He has the support of extremely extremist groups that are extremely galvanized and are willing to push for these changes to happen and to come to fruition. But also, he has a history of withstanding great crises that happened in Israel. He is seen as a leader of Israeli people. He is seen as the man that brokered incredible things for the Israeli people and the nation. He's seen as the one that allowed them to have their nation, that allowed them to be to win the wars and stuff like that. Notice also, he already has the support of parties who are willing to stand for this reform. This looks like religious Zionists, social conservatives, Shah party, and these parties that have extreme support in the citizens of Israel. This is to say that they have